All right, so once again, to all of you who are joining us this morning, it's indeed our pleasure that you have found time to join us this morning for this very important occasion. As most of you are aware, the extractive sector is one of the sectors which has been quite widely discussed around the world because of its potential benefits to countries. And at NRGI, one of our work has been to sort of really try to work around the sector, but also to see how best we can help governments, but also citizens around the world to improve their governance of the extractive sector. The NRGI, as most of you are aware, is a global organization working around the world, basically focusing primarily on the extractive sector, on the three elements of the extractive sector. And this morning, we are very delighted to be launching the NRGI. The NRGI is one of the tools that NRGI conducts around the world. So most of the details will be presented shortly, but I must say that on behalf of NRGI, I would want to welcome again this morning. My name's Moses Kulaba, and I'm the East Africa Regional Manager for NRGI. I'm based in Nairobi, and also working with our teams in Uganda, Kenya, and Tanzania. I'm supported by a very diverse global team, and most of you will perhaps have a chance to meet. So I want to thank you for finding time again to join us this morning. The way we are planning to do this event is supposed to take at least a maximum of 1.5 hours or latest 2 hours. And through this 1 or 2 hours, we shall have a chance to look through the NRGI for Uganda, but also have an opportunity to discuss some of the findings from that study. We are very, very delighted once again this morning to be joined by Mr. Moses Kagwa from the Ministry of Finance, who is actually the chief economist of the country. And Mr. Kagwa has been around this country for a while, for a long time, but also he has been very, very much involved in the transformations, the economic transformation of the country, and particularly the extractive sector. So I think you're very privileged to have you today join us on this very important occasion. Mr. Kagwa will also be supported by 2 distinguished panelists who will be sort of really giving some perspectives to the findings. And one of them will be Mr. Onesmus Mugenyi. Mr. Onesmus Mugenyi works for Accord, whose full details are Advocates Coalition for Development and Environment. Of course, they'll have a chance to introduce themselves in details, and we shall get to know what they do, and perhaps maybe have a chance as well as they share their perspectives. We are also privileged to have Ms. Nelly Bushinje. Ms. Nelly Bushinje currently works for Publish What You Pay, and she's the Africa Membership Engagement Manager for Africa. She has also worked in the sector for a long time. And of course, as most of you are aware, Publish What You Pay is also very actively engaged within the extractive sector governance across the world. So such a very distinguished panel of presenters, but also of discussants, and of course, as we said, being groomed by a very distinguished government official from the Ministry of Finance for Uganda. So thank you so much. And once again, my dearest thanks for you for joining us this morning. The presentation, of course, will be made by Mr. Paul Bagabo, who is a Uganda senior officer at NRGI. I'm sure most of you have met him before, for those who have worked in country, but for others who have not met him before, I think this is the time that he will be presenting himself, and he'll be very delighted for him to present us today this morning. With those few opening remarks, let me now yield over to Paul, who will kick us off. Paul, you're welcome.
Welcome, everybody. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here with you today to talk about resource governance in the country. I think, can we mute, please? Those who are not speaking, please mute. So I think what we want to do today, before I present the index, is to give an opportunity to Mr. Kagua to give us a keynote address and so lay the foundation for the discussions that we want to have today. So, ladies and gentlemen, I want to welcome Mr. Moses Kagua, and I'll hand it over to him to give us the keynote address, and then we shall go into the details of the index. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Good morning to you all. I must say I'm honored to give a keynote address to this very important occasion that has been organized by the Natural Resource Governance Institute, which is intended to launch the Resource Governance Index for 2021. As you are aware, government, along with several oil companies, have discovered over 20 commercial oil fields estimated to hold between 1.5 to 2.7 million barrels of oil that is recoverable. Of course, this discovery could place Uganda among the big oil companies or producers in Uganda. I'm glad to inform you that the final investment decision will soon be taken. This is in light of the various agreements that have been negotiated and signed between the government of Uganda and the oil companies. These include the host government agreement, transportation and tariff agreement, and the shareholders agreement. Of course, the mining side, we have been doing a lot of work with support from the World Bank. We completed the National Mineral Survey in 2014. The survey revealed the presence of high-value minerals such as uranium, tin, coltan, nickel, copper, gold, limestone, clay, salt, and stone aggregates, among others. The mining industry is a major contributor to Uganda's economy. The contribution of mining and quarrying industry to GDP increased from 1.1% in 2016-17 to 2.3% in 2020-21. And this development is a result of the use of online mineral licensing, the biometric registration system, the construction of regional beneficiation centers, and training of 13,000 artisanal miners. Artisanal mining, of course, accounts for more than 90% of the metallic, industrial, and build materials and provides livelihoods to almost 350,000 individuals. Following the discovery of petroleum and mineral resources in Uganda, the government has taken steps to establish adequate policy, legal, and institutional framework to ensure proper management of the petroleum and mineral resources of the country in a transparent and prudent manner. The policy and legal framework developed by the government include the following. One, the National Oil and Gas Policy 2008, the Oil and Gas Revenue Management Policy 2012, the Petroleum Exploration, Development and Production Act 2013, Petroleum Refining, Conversion, Storage and Transportation Act 2013, Public Finance Management Act for Petroleum Revenue Management. We have the Mining Act, which we are reviewing. Government has also developed a model production sharing agreement to guide future contract negotiations. Other priority interventions that we are doing especially in the mining industry this financial year is to establish the mineral reserves that are economically feasible for extraction in 80% of the country and complete the airborne geophysical surveys of the remaining 20% in the Karamoja sub-region. We are also finalizing the mining law and enhancing public-private partnerships arrangements to develop minerals, starting with iron ore in Western Uganda, restoration of the Katwe salt factory, and provision of an attractive taxation regime that protects and supports local steel production. We're exploring all the geothermal resources to quantify the geothermal potential of the country and develop Kibiro, Katwe, Boranga, and Manyuimul geothermal prospects. These laws and policies have been put in place to streamline the roles of the relevant institutions and to provide for efficiency in the management of the extractive industries in Uganda. Of course, while significant progress has been made in terms of policy and legal framework, more work needs to be done in the area of governance of the extractive sector. The strong policy and regulatory framework needs to be complemented with good governance practices. Good governance practices include accountability, transparency, and participation of citizens in the entire extractive industry value chain. These practices help to promote competition, to attract investment, and to ensure fairness and a level playing field for business owners. Practicing good governance is a precondition for ensuring that the good dividend, the development dividend, becomes a reality. It's therefore essential for countries that are resource rich to put in place adequate mechanisms that can enhance transparency, accountability, and participation of citizens. This is the safest way for developing resource-rich countries to reduce poverty and foster economic development. For a country to achieve good governance, various institutions, including the central government, local governments, private sector, and civil society, need to work together. This is where institutions such as the Natural Resource Governance Institute and Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative come in to complement the efforts of government. As you all know, government recently joined the EATI. The EATI is a global standard aimed to promote transparency and accountability in the management of extractive industry. The EATI is also a multi-stakeholder initiative that brings together different stakeholders, including government institutions, civil society, and the private sector, to promote good governance in the extractive sector. By joining the EATI, government demonstrated its commitment for good governance in the extractive sector in Uganda. Further, in addition to good policies, laws, and regulatory frameworks and transparency initiatives, such as the Public Finance Management Act and the EATI, we also need to put emphasis on measuring the quality of governance in the extractive sector. It is therefore important for us to appreciate the Resource Governance Index as a tool for that purpose. In that regard, the strong regulatory framework, EITI and NRGI, should be viewed as complementary to each other to ensure that there is good governance within the extractive sector. Finally, I would like to take the opportunity to commend the Natural Resource Governance Institute for the good work and in particular, contributing to good governance outcomes by A, establishing a benchmark standard that is agreed to by domestic governments and corporations, B, providing a policy platform to encourage peer learning and knowledge sharing, and C, creating international networks of civil servants, corporate executives, civil society activists, and development practitioners with shared standards and commitments to good governance practices. We'll continue to work together for the better of the extractive industries and for purposes of sharing knowledge and information. The NRGI remains a key tool for us in assessing the quality of our performance, in strengthening the management of our extractive industries in order to benefit the country and its citizens. I thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak at this launch of Uganda's NRGI, and I wish you all fruitful deliberations. Thank you.
Thank you indeed, Mr. Kagwa, for those very wonderful remarks. Indeed, Uganda's extractive sector has evolved for many years. As a country, I think there's a lot that you have to be proud about. And I think there's a lot of potential. And I think as you well affirmed, if well managed, I think there's a lot that the country can gain. Our experience across the world shows that's what's very important. Countries not only just leverage on what they have, but they also leverage on their systems and the practices to benefit from the resources. And I think, as rightly pointed out, that if there is a deficit in one of those areas, the likelihood that countries are not able to benefit from that wealth is quite high. For us who have been working in this sector for a while, I must commend you as a country for all the efforts that you have done and how long that you came. I remember as a young child, we used to learn about the potentials in that country. And I think growing up and seeing that now that's coming to fruition is very, very important. Of course, the NRGI, as you said, is a complementary tool. And at NRGI, we are very proud that we're producing this information, which provides us and you as governments a basis for just making an assessment and an audit of where we are. Basically, it's not a report card of a fail or a pass, but it's just a basis for sort of reflecting to see which areas that need to be improved. And with these remarks, let me now invite Paul, who will tell us a little bit more about what the NRGI is. He'll be sharing a video, then we shall also go into the details in regards to how far we have gone as a country for Uganda.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moses Kagwa, for those words. And thank you very much, Moses, for the introduction. I'll try to share my screen so that we can start. Just do let me know if you can see it.
As Paul brings his screen on board, I just wanted to remind our colleagues that if you are, I think that the standard procedures most of you are aware about, if you're not speaking, please just mute. But also because of the time, we may not all of us have chance to ask any questions physically. So if you have some questions, please, I encourage you to put them in the chat along the way. Paul.
Thank you. Once again, I've been introduced, and in the interest of time, I'll just say that my name is Paul Bagabo, and I work for the Natural Resource Governance Institute here in Uganda. I've worked here since 2012, and we've interacted with most of the people here. For today, would like to launch and introduce this Resource Governance Index to you for 2021, and I'll just talk a little bit about what the index is, how it was calculated. I'll introduce the summaries of the results, and then go deeper into assessing what those results mean in the oil and gas sector and in the mining. And then I'll conclude with some recommendations. We're pleased to say that in 2017, we only assessed the oil and gas sector. In this year, we have results for both oil and gas and mining. And so we hope that this will be a real benchmark for reform in the sector. But first, I just want to play a video of what the resource index is.
Effective governance of the oil, gas, and mining sectors is a persistent challenge around the world. If well managed, resource wealth has the potential to improve the lives of over 1 billion people living in poverty in resource-rich countries. However, the lack of transparency and absence of accountability in the extractive sector means that citizens often don't see the benefits of their nation's resources. Additionally, poor governance can lead to corruption, environmental damage, and even violence and conflict. Our mission at the Natural Resource Governance Institute is to ensure that countries rich in oil, gas, and minerals achieve sustainable, inclusive development, and that people receive lasting benefits from extractives and experience reduced harms. NRGI's Resource Governance Index is a robust, evidence-based tool that allows stakeholders such as governments, civil society actors, private companies, and citizens to understand how well countries realize value from their resources, how well they manage revenues, and how the broader political and economic context affects resource governance. To create the index, independent researchers answer almost 200 questions regarding natural resource governance, providing justifications and supporting documentation for their answers. After thorough review by experts, NRGI calculates, analyzes, and disseminates the scores. Recent events and the accelerating climate crisis provide the opportunity for countries to build back better. How oil, gas, and mining resources are governed will play a key role in how societies develop. The Resource Governance Index tells the story of resource governance around the world and provides a roadmap for policy and practice reforms. It's a critical tool for those who aim to promote transparency, demand accountability, and drive reform in the extractive sector. This year, we are launching the newest edition of the Resource Governance Index, focusing on 18 countries. Country-specific data and analysis will be published on a rolling basis throughout the year. To learn more about the Resource Governance Index, visit www.resourcegovernanceindex.org.
Thank you. Basically, I think the director was just saying that was replaying that video and saying that resource governance should complement the regulatory framework and the resources that exist in order to have a complete picture so that citizens can benefit. So what did the RGI measure? The RGI was a little bit limited in what it could do. And so what we really measured was the existence of rules, laws, or policies, and actual practices related to the disclosure of information, transparency, and oversight. Basically, and this is very important, we used publicly available information. We do appreciate that there's a lot of information that would show that the government is doing a lot. And unfortunately, most of this information is not publicly available, so the public doesn't have an opportunity to view it. And so what we used here was publicly available information in order to continue to encourage government to publish information, to publish details of other indicators that can improve the governance. And then we dealt with issues that are comparable across countries and sectors. Due to constraints, we really didn't measure the quality, success, or appropriateness of policies, the context-based or that requires subjective judgment, and we didn't also measure certain external factors. So for example, if we measured that the country has a royalty system and which is embedded in the law, we didn't go into the details of measuring whether that rate is appropriate or whether the districts are actually receiving the money the way they are meant to receive. And so we hope that that is additional work that can build off the RGI so that we have a complete picture. So in that way, there are certain parameters that we didn't measure during this course. Then how did we calculate scores? So what we have as a score for Uganda is a component score, which is an aggregate of 3 main components. 2 of them are extractive sector components, that is value realization and revenue management. And they cover the key policy areas that NRGI worked on and which are asked about in the questionnaire. But we also dealt with 2 other areas, the enabling environment, which covers the broader governance context outside the extractive sector, but which has an impact of the extractive's governance and management in the country, and ultimately it might affect whether we benefit or not from the sector. We also had some non-applicable questions that were not scored, but which were important in order to build the complete picture. So in terms of the detail, in terms of value realization, we looked at the licensing, the taxation, the local impacts, and state-owned enterprise. In terms of the revenue management, we looked at the transparency around national budgeting, subnational resource revenue sharing, and the sovereign wealth fund, including the national oil company where it exists. In terms of the enabling environment, this wasn't asked directly as part of the questionnaire, So we used secondary data like the World Bank documents and so on, and we were looking at issues around voice and accountability, government effectiveness, regulatory quality, rule of law, control of corruption, political stability, and absence of violence, as well as open data management. And the NRGI framework also looked at things. On one hand, along those parameters, we looked at the law itself, the existence of the law, and public availability of the laws and regulations, as well as the practice, the disclosure, the enforcement, adherence to the laws in practice. So in a way, in a nutshell, we were asking the question, do these countries actually have laws that can improve governance? And if they do, how well are these laws being disclosed, being enforced, or adhered to? And as you'll see, we also have a score for the difference between the law itself and the practice, which we've called the gap between the written laws and enforcement in a given country. And so we will appreciate as we move along that these were some of the justifications for the scoring that was done, but most of the work and the questions were asked and answered by a set of researchers. We also had a peer reviewer, and then after that, we looked at the results and tried to score. So I'm not going to waste, in the interest of time, I'm not going to talk about timelines, but we started this whole process in mid-2020. And this process actually went on, and the research only covered the period until December 2020. And so there are very many developments that have taken place in 2021. We appreciate them. Unfortunate, and maybe they would have improved our outlook as a country to the governance. Unfortunately, due to certain restrictions, we were not able to cover those developments. We hope as we move along that the next RGI will be able to cover that. So we wanted to bring this summary, and I brought it at the beginning so that those, if for any reason your technology betrays you, the one takeaway you'll go with is that what is the component score of Uganda in terms of oil and gas and mining? In terms of mining, the average score is 55 out of 100, and in terms of oil and gas, it's 49 out of 100. As I said earlier, the score for Uganda in 2017 was 44, and we see improvements in the governance, but we also think, as the director said, more work needs to be done. Also, it might be misleading for you to think that mining is doing better than oil and gas. No, we didn't compare these two. What we did was to assess the mining sector separately using certain indicators and assess the oil and gas separately. Although many of the questions were quite very similar, but ideally we didn't compare mining and oil and gas as this shows, and it might be misleading. The other one that I wanted to come up with at the onset is to say that while these results look good, as a country, we're still within the weak scores band. We need to move more. Luckily enough, we're not poor and we're not failing. We need to move further into satisfactory and eventually into the good scores. And that can be done by addressing some of the issues that the commission, the director has pointed out, as well as some of the recommendations we have here. In terms of the detail, we had 4 or 5 main findings. That there were improvements from 44 to 49, and these were driven by improvements in revenue transparency, the governance of the Uganda National Oil Company, and reporting on the performance of the Petroleum Fund. We still find challenges with licensing, and this is hampered by the absence of a cadastre in the oil and gas sector, the lack of beneficial ownership rules, and government's failure to disclose contracts with oil and gas companies. Also, the governance of local impacts also is still lacking, and we found it poor in performance. We find that although numerical fiscal rules are documented in public policy, these are not enshrined in law, and there's no adherence requirement or monitoring by government. As well, despite improvements in the governance of the Petroleum Fund, laws regarding deposits, withdrawals, and investment rules are still lack, and there's need for further reform in order to improve those areas. And that is a summary. In more detail, for value realization, we looked at the licensing, the taxation, the local impacts, and state-owned enterprise. So I've talked briefly about this. Maybe it's one area that I will talk a little bit more on issues around public disclosure of environmental and social impacts. We realize that these are not truly public as the law provides, and they're contingent on approval, and such pose a financial barrier to some applicants. And I'll explain in a little bit more detail. And the governance of the Uganda National Company has improved overall due to active development of its downstream supply and distribution operations. And we find that gradually, since the inception of the Uganda National Company, there's been improvements, and that has also improved the score of the country. In terms of revenue management, I think the country does a good job in disclosure of both the debt, but it has not yet passed the law on setting the numerical fiscal rule. We appreciate that the Charter of Fiscal Rules responsibility was adopted in 2015, and this set out the numeric targets. However, until now, I think this hasn't yet been enforced, and as we speak, the rules haven't yet been enshrined in the Charter. We hope that this is one of the issues that can be addressed in order to improve overall guidance. In terms of the Petroleum Fund and the Revenue Investment Reserve, the financial reporting is actually published and discussed in Parliament. However, as I've pointed out, we still need numerical rules governing withdrawals, both to the Consolidated Fund and to the Petroleum Revenue Investment Reserve. And we don't have a publicly available legal requirement detailing asset classes that need to be invested in using our fund. As well, the laws relating to prohibition of investments domestically is not very clear, and that leaves room for domestic investment of the funds arising from the PRIR. In terms of law and practice, I think this is where we still find some challenge, that the country has very good laws, and the laws have been enumerated by the director. And we found that some of the laws have actually been implemented. For example, the establishment of rules relating to UNOC's future operation. However, there are still challenges, and this increased the gap between the law and the implementation. In 2017, it was negative 11, and in 2021, we see that has increased by 7 to negative 18. For example, rules relating to pre-licensing rounds were not matched with disclosures in the governance of local impacts, and the lack of disclosure of environmental and social impacts and the environmental mitigation plan also resulted in low scores. In terms of the environmental and social impact assessments, we note that the law provides for their disclosure, but Section 146 of the NEMA Act also goes ahead to say you can only get this information after an application in writing and on payment of a prescribed fee. And we think that that is restrictive and prevents the public from access of these resources, of this information. I'll quickly go into mining. The score for mining was only assessed for the first time this year, and the score was 55. In terms of value realization, the score was 52. In terms of revenue management, it was 63. And in terms of enabling environment, the score was 50 out of 100. So on average, the score for mining was 55. Now, we found that there are some positive features in the mining laws and practices, the existence of an open mining cadastre, reforms in the fiscal regime and robust rules for disclosure, and auditing of subnational resource revenue sharing mechanisms. However, issues exist within the licensing process and the governance of local impacts, and this is an area which requires further improvement. In terms of value realization, because the country doesn't have a state-owned mining enterprise, that wasn't scored and wasn't assessed. So we looked at the licensing, the taxation, and issues around how the disclosure of environmental and social impact assessments. In terms of this disclosure, this seems to be a common challenge because the restriction and the challenges around disclosure relate to both mining and oil and gas. As well, there isn't adequate information on any contracts that have been signed between government and mining companies, both for the large companies, but also for small companies. As well, there's no laws requiring public disclosure of beneficial owners of extractive companies, and no information on the real owners of companies has been published. And please mark the word published, because we were looking at publicly available information. In terms of revenue management, we looked at the national budgeting, and we also looked at subnational revenue resource sharing. We found that the budgeting is still weak due to absence of fiscal rules that will dictate deposits, withdrawals, and expenditure of revenues. However, the government, I think, has been prudent in disclosing both the national budget, debt levels, and projections from extractive revenues, I think, are set out every year in the national budget. But we're waiting, and we continue to push for laws relating to numerical fiscal rules to be inserted in the Charter of Fiscal Responsibility, and to be legally enforceable. In terms of law and practice, the mining sector, we realize that the gap here is a little bit smaller than the gap in oil and gas. What does this mean? It means that the laws that have been set up, most of them are being implemented. And as I noted earlier, we didn't go into the details of the effectiveness of that implementation, but we appreciate that in the mining sector, I think the laws are being implemented, and there is a small deviation. So you can see, compared to oil and gas, the deviation here is only -7, the implementation gap. And especially this relates to the issues around disclosure of environmental and social impact assessments, so that the public can well understand what needs to be mitigated. In terms of the neighboring environment, we drew on data from credible external and public sources, and we covered a broad range. And so the average that we gave of 50 is actually an average of a number of indicators, as you know, and these indicators are actually around the governance. These include the rule of law, as I pointed out, voice and accountability, regulatory quality, control of corruption, and political stability. And the scores are here. We also looked at a number of things that are important for governance, but did not really count for the final score in the mining sector. We appreciate that there is in the new Mining Act a requirement for license holders to take all reasonable measures to process minerals domestically. Specified conditions for large-scale mining projects also exist that require a measure of domestic value addition. And the government, I think, has also imposed an export ban on various unprocessed minerals, although the enforcement was a challenge and this ban was lifted eventually. We also note, which is of importance, that Uganda holds reserves of minerals considered critical in energy transition. And these, as the director pointed out, include cobalt, nickel, copper, and copper. And these are important for one reason. As the use of fossil fuel starts to decline, and we hope that will happen, these minerals will form the basis of the materials that will be required for energy transition, batteries, cables, and so on. And so we would request government to leverage these reserves to attract large-scale investment, but also to ensure that you get a good deal out of them. And so we hope that we'll improve the institutional framework or the long-term vision, which is not yet adequately developed in the policies and laws that exist. For those that want to look at both these things, we've set out this last chart. As I said, you should not take it as a comparison between mining and oil and gas. But generally, we found that in the mining sector, there were a few policies that would serve to improve the mining sector governance if properly implemented. And some of these policies can really be also adopted in the oil and gas sector, and vice versa. There are also some good policies, good practices in the oil and gas sector that can also be adopted to improve mining sector governance. And I think looking at the policies that are upcoming, that government has taken this step to kind of adopt some of the best practices in mining for the oil and gas, but also in oil and gas for the mining sector. I'll wind up with a few recommendations. The first one, which is important, is about publication. Publication of contracts signed with executive companies. And this, we hope, will allow the public to examine whether Uganda is getting a good deal from its oil and gas resources. As we said, the government has a good policy, but the policy hasn't been followed by publication. We're happy to note, though, that signing to the EITI, which has a requirement for publication, I think will help government to move forward on this reform. And we hope that we shall see some results in the coming years as a result of implementation of the EITI. We hope and we want to see some of these reforms in the first report of the EITI, which comes out next year. Also, the government set out good provisions on beneficial owners ownership in the upstream law and in the midstream law. However, the identity of beneficial owners in the oil and gas sector is not publicly available. As I say, these provisions exist, and information around the beneficial owners, if published, I think will go a long way in improving the governance of the sector. Finally, we hope that the National Environment Management Authority can ensure environmental and social impact assessments and environmental mitigation plans are freely and easily accessible through its online portal. When we talk about freely and easily accessible, we're talking about a restrictive requirement that you need to apply and you need to pay a specified fee in order to access this information. Fourthly, we hope that the government would adopt laws setting out a firm numerical fiscal rule governing public expenditure of oil and gas revenues and establish an oversight authority to ensure compliance is regularly monitored. The Petroleum Fund should set these numerical rules governing deposits and withdrawals, as well as firm rules governing the investment of oil revenues. Also, and finally, which is important, is we hope that government can publish online documents that are key online and information about oil and gas sector. This will ensure that they're easily and publicly accessible, reporting the depth required by, and report to the depth required by EITI, excuse me. In the mining sector, similar to the oil and gas sector, we would like to see improvements in the publication of the assessments of environmental and social assessments. Publication of information about the mining sector is encouraged to ensure that they are easily accessible, and reporting is done to the depth as is required by the EITI. Similarly to the oil and gas sector, we hope that there could be some rules governing how revenues from the mining sector are banked, are received, banked, withdrawn, and spent. And then finally, we hope that Uganda can take cognizance of the critical minerals that it has, such as cobalt, nickel, and copper, which will be critical to the energy transition, and put in place robust mechanisms to ensure that citizens benefit when exploitation commences. I want to stop here and thank you very much for listening. Questions and comments are welcome. Thank you.
Thank you so much indeed, Paul, for such a very detailed presentation. Of course, as you said, the links are available. Perhaps they'll be shared in the chats where colleagues around the world can log in and just have access to the detailed information about the findings. Friends and colleagues, I can tell you that when you look through the presentation, sometimes it can be quite distressing, perhaps, especially where you see where the scores are sort of really within the weak bands. But I want to assure you that the extractive journey and the governance of the extractive sector is a very long journey. And my experience working for a while in Tanzania for many years, Eastern and Southern Africa for many years as well, and serving on the board of the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, and having access to many countries around the world, I can tell you it's a very long journey, and the countries struggle along the way. But what's very important is that when you see where you're weak, how you pick up from there and try to improve is what's very important. And I think the NRGI and the findings that Paul has just shared just point out some of those areas where perhaps as government, you can look back and say, perhaps we need to improve here and work there. So let me just encourage you that even with some of those areas which are ranked weak, we can still do much and we can have some progress made. And I think that has been the experience from some other countries, including countries like Senegal, which have been improved significantly. So thank you so much for that. And I think we shall have chance, of course, to tease that out and some questions around that. Again, I want to encourage you to put some questions in the chat. And of course, panelists, keep your eye there. There are some questions already coming through, which will be posted to you. Now, at this point, the extractive sector, as most of you have realized, is a tripartite, sort of governed between governments, civil society, and companies. And each and every person or each segment of this has a role to play and has a voice to share. And at this point, I want to invite our colleagues from the civil society to also share some perspectives about the findings, but also some general insights about what they see and perhaps what could be taken into consideration. So to kick us off, let me invite Nelly, she will be our first discussant, to share a few perspectives from Publish What You Pay. As I said, Nelly works with Publish What You Pay, and she's the Africa Membership Engagement Manager. She will tell you more about what Publish What You Pay does, but in a few minutes, just to share a few perspectives about the findings and reflections on behalf of the global civil society movement, but also that has been very active in Uganda. Nelly.
Thank you, Moses. Thank you, Paul. Thank you for the presentation. I'm really happy to join this discussion. I'm happy about the findings, and I believe they are consistent with so many of the issues that civil society has raised across the board. I'm very keen to see how we take this forward. So hopefully we'll get into discussions on some of the follow-up actions. based on the recommendations that you've shared. As Publisher Chipre, of course, we do promote an open and accountable extractive sector. So for me, my feedback and maybe insight is really to just point out some of the issues that are actually consistent with what some of our colleagues are putting in that chat, but also basically what Paul shared, especially around disclosure of information, transparency. We're not doing very well. And I think when it comes to the EITI and where we are at now with EITI, we are more or less compelled, strongly compelled to be open and accountable as far as the standard is concerned. And I think one of the underlying issues I see across the discussion, the presentation that Paul has shared, and even perhaps what we've discussed as civil society for the last couple of years, is around disclosure of information and contracts especially. And my worry is, especially when it comes to EITI being a new country in this process, in the initiative, is how far we're going to go to make sure that we're actually compliant. Because if you see the information that Paul was saying that is not open, especially around the agreements, the deals that are signed, we're compelled by the EITI to actually provide that information to the public domain. And it's also consistent with what the Publisher Chipre movement is really pushing for in the Disclose the Deal campaign that we're currently running, and pushing for openness and pushing for scrutiny among different stakeholders. And the fact that that many of this, just the EITI process is a stakeholder approach. So you find civil society, government, and sitting on the same table, but government has the information and civil society doesn't. And that becomes a very difficult situation when we are also called to hold a government accountable, but also participate actively in the process. So I think there, the ground is not leveled, and I think Mr. Kagwa really needs to provide some insight on how that is going to be managed, especially in the context of our oil and gas sector, and of course the mining sector as well. And I think there are around the issues of beneficial ownership. I took note of what Paul had shared, but also seeing that in some places it seems that it's not consistent, and that comes down to the issue around EITI as well, and how much information we need to have that then we know. And I guess in a way we kind of know who owns what informally. I mean, you see investigative reports in the media and who owns which license and whatnot, but it's there, but it's not official. And so we will need to be compelled because of the kind of initiative, the kind of processes that we've been we're subscribing to. Maybe the one thing I was just, I guess, wondering about, but also perhaps maybe for future indexes, the voice and accountability component Paul talked about, and the fact that you didn't, get into the detail of that beyond the World Bank reports, I guess, but perhaps in the future, the index can look at it beyond that, because it's a very critical issue, especially in the context within which we are working in. And the fact that the space for civil society is shrinking in Uganda, and there are so many challenges. And so I'm actually curious to see how the EITI will play out, considering it's a multi-stakeholder approach. And the fact that it's not a level playing field, especially for us as civil society. So I think putting in effort in that, I think as a country, and really providing that environment where information is open and it is there, and there is no hiding, and there is no fear of favor, whether there is some criticism or constructive criticism from non-state actors like us. I think it's important that government really opens up. And I noted that the implementation gap between enacted laws and the enforcement is in practice, I think, has widened. And that is also a problem. So while we are pushing for more openness, we are pushing for more operationalization of laws, the challenge also comes down to implementation. And most times Uganda is caught in that, confusion, I guess. But yeah, so for me, I just wanted to emphasize that, and also emphasize, in practice, what Publisher Chipre is really pushing for. Even the coalitions that we work with, I'm privileged to work with, with so many coalitions. We have, I think, about 51 coalitions across the world, and they're all pushing for the same thing. So Uganda is not, unique to this issue. And so it's really important that our government takes on these issues, but also as civil society,
Mm-hmm. Thank you indeed, Nelly. I think for those perspectives there, I think some emphasis on transparency matters, and especially what that means for Uganda's EITI journey, but also the findings, and perhaps some reflections as well in terms of what could be done. Well, the good thing is that Mr. Moses Kagwa knows this journey so much. I had the chance, and I was very privileged to meet him a couple of times outside Uganda, I think as he was negotiating the journey towards Uganda's recognition. And I think he knows exactly what this means for the country. And I can also see that Ms. Gloria Mugambe is on the call. So perhaps these could be some of the points that she takes home, but maybe also some points of reflection. So basically, maybe at some point, yes, he will have some chance. They'll have some chance to also share some more perspectives in regards to what that means. Because you're right that there could be some kind of requirements or some kind of things that need to be put in place. And of course, the NRGI is pointing us that we need to take some actions perhaps before the validation takes place. Now, let me also bring in another dimension of the civil society, also to share some perspectives. Then thereafter, we shall take a round of questions if you have some questions specifically. And again, as I said, there are already some questions which are coming in through the chat. So the panelists, some are directed to Mr. Kagwa. Please just look at the chat and just try to figure out. I'll give you some time to get some responses at the end of this, but also some clarity. So let me invite Onesmus Mgenyi, since Onesmus is just a very big name in civil society in Uganda. Most of you have had a chance to meet him. I think for those who are joining globally, who may have known Onesmus Mgenyi, he works for Advocates Coalition for Development and Environment, which is a very robust organization working in Uganda for many years on these issues, particularly around issues related to governance. We are very pleased to have you, sir, and please, some of your thoughts about the findings.
Thank you, Moses, for that introduction. And indeed, my name is Onesmus Mgenyi. I work with the Advocates Coalition for Development and Environment, and I do research as my source of livelihood. I want to appreciate, first of all, the NRGI team. For those who are involved in research, it takes an effort, both in terms of energy and financial resources, to put up a tool like this one. And I think it's a job that is well done. Having said that, I just have some observations and a few comments to make. And I will just move into that without wasting time. One, I think it's now appreciated that the Resource Governance Index has gained some level of credence over the years and is now being used by civil society and government, and I know in particular government of Uganda, as an indicator to measure performance of the extractive sector in the country. And of course, that requires consistency in terms of production, but also in terms of country ranking. I think the country ranking has been used to look at, to compare across countries, and that peer pressure in advocacy is very important for countries to see where they stand compared to the sister countries. So I think that is important. So 2017, we know Uganda was standing at 51st, if I'm not mistaken. And I was trying to calculate now with a lot of difficulty to know exactly where it stands. My second observation is that really this particular index, 2021, like the 2017, it provides a good mirror from which government can reflect on the weaknesses that have been identified. It provides a very good feedback to government, and if the findings are taken seriously and weaknesses addressed, I think we can see some improvement in the performance of the sector. I also note that there is value added. 2017, we're looking at petroleum. Now this particular one talks about mining as well. And given the country's zeal to develop this sector, I think that is value addition. However, what I find a little bit intriguing is where we did the comparison and they said the mining sector is well governed compared to the oil sector. So we may need to clarify some of the parameters there, because we seem to be saying we are comparing, but we are not comparing. So I found some difficulty there. And the real parameters that puts mining in a better position compared to the oil and gas sector. When you look particularly, when you look at the value realization and local impact, and you look at the performance, which is certainly not good, I find it very consistent with what is happening at the local level. Because when you look at issues of environment, you look at issues of biodiversity destruction, it is very consistent. But I've also been looking at the World Bank reports, and I looked at one of 2015 that was looking at socioeconomic impact of mining on local communities in Africa, which concludes that the resource boom in Africa has translated into marginal welfare indicators. And I find the finding very consistent. And I imagine Mr. Moses Kagwa will take that as a very important point. Again, under the enabling environment, either we're a little bit shy or the parameters that we used, that's where they point us. But I think there is also limited accountability and responsiveness of sector institutions, and of course, other governance deficits. And I think Nire has pointed some of those areas, the civil society space, but there are also other governance deficits that probably are worth mentioning there. I also look at the performance trends, which are a little bit mixed. And I appreciate where we performed well But I think there are areas where we need very serious reflection, especially where we've seen negative trends. Those areas are very, very clear. I don't want to go into the detail because of the time limitation, but the scores do indicate the areas where actually we've moved backwards, where we're negative. And I think those are areas that our colleague Moses Kagwa and the group should be able to look at critically. My second last point is the index largely looked at laws and policies. If you look at that parameter, and we're basically looking at the laws in place. And I think we need now to move beyond that, because I think Uganda has fairly done well in putting in place policies and laws, and that has been echoed in many other fora. So what we need to be focusing on, and I think where the resource governance index should be taking us, is how those laws are performing, the effectiveness of those laws. And I think that's where the country has a bigger problem, and we need to be looking at, are these laws being implemented? What is the problem? Why are we not achieving the results, yet we have the laws? But I also thought that one area, since we are talking about governance, one area that I find a little bit problematic is the coordination mechanisms. So while you have these policies and you have the laws and you have an elaborate institutional framework, we still see a very big problem. And one of those problems is about coordination mechanisms. And I think an index of this nature could also help us to look into those aspects, because you have the policies, you have the laws, you have the institutions, but we still have challenge. And one of those challenges is about coordination, where you have an coordinated movement of troops, where decisions are made before you even do an environmental impact assessment. And therefore, when you do the environmental impact assessment, you must make sure that it fits into the decisions that have been made, yet the environmental and social impact assessments are supposed to inform the decisions. And I think that's an area where we have a challenge in terms of coordination. I would stop at that, Moses, and if there are some specific follow-up questions that you think I need to respond to, I can gladly do that. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks indeed, Onesmus, for those very wonderful, insightful perspectives and thoughts. And of course, the very important point that you bring out, that let us look at some of those areas where there have been some kind of sleep and see exactly where do we go wrong and how can we improve? Because in any case, some of these frameworks, we put them there for a purpose. So if we put them there and we're not implementing them, then that means that there's a gap and there's something which is not right. And I think it's very important that the country to reflect ourselves and see where are we going wrong, and if there's need for reform, or if it's need for institution, or if there's anything that's missing, to see how we cure those deficits. As I said, that's very fundamental in terms of building your capacity and leverage and unleashing the potential that you have in your extractive sector. So thank you so much. I think now what I plan to do was that if there are any questions, I wanted them to be taken at a go, then we shall have chance to respond to them. And of course, in terms of the way it will flow, Mr. Kagwa will have the last word. So he will have chance to sort of really, if there are any issues that needs to be done, he will be our last respondent. So if there are any specific questions to the two panelists or the three panelists, I'll be very happy to take them now. Anybody who has some specific questions, of course, you can raise your hand or you can send a chat in the chat. I will give you something like 5 minutes to do that. But in the meantime, there are some questions that have been brought forward to you, and maybe let me just read them such that you begin to think about them. The first question comes, I think, from Simon Taylor, and I think this must be addressed to government. It says a major concern is also related to threats and intimidation of citizens on the pathway. This continues and will be very problematic with respect to Uganda's compliance with the Society Protocol, which, if it is found to be in breach of, will lead to Uganda being suspended from the ITI. We also had a question about contract disclosure, particularly the ones relating to the EACOP. I think that's something that perhaps Mr. Kagwa will want also to give some perspective about. Again, there's also something about the Solicitor General, I think saying only yesterday or the day before said that the contracts related to EACOP shall not be disclosed, since Total claims that it publishes its contracts if other parties agree. So I think there's that question as well. Mr. Kagwa, perhaps if you have some insights to share, or if anybody has some insights. I also see that the number of government officials on the call, apart from Mr. Kagwa. So if there's anybody who wants to share some perspectives, that would be very welcome. There is also a question about projections for revenues, again from Simon Taylor as well. And I think also that's something that you might want to take on and give some perspectives. Again, Mr. Moses, if you have some time, it's very fundamental. It's talking about the revenue streams. There is also another question about the legal framework disempowering local governments. I think that is something that perhaps maybe Onesimus was referring to, and I think it's also well captured in the NRGI. That at some point, the LGAs feel that they're being disempowered somehow, and perhaps how do you strengthen that to avoid that tug of war and constant ping pong between the central government and legal and local government authorities, but largely also the communities where the extractive resources are found. Let me just start off by asking a general question in regards to, I think, to all of you, in terms of how you see the landscape evolving, and particularly when it comes to the gap between implementation and execution of laws. What are some of the significant challenges that are making this not be quite moving progressively as it should? And the other question, of course, related to transparency, will about the cadastre. Of course, as Paul mentioned, Uganda has a fairly good mining cadastre. It's not very excellent yet, but I think it's sort of really fairly there. But this seems to be sort of really not existing in the oil and gas sector. So any perspectives why this is not the case, and perhaps how this could be done, and that will be very helpful. And of course, there was also an issue of beneficial ownership. What's the progress so far, and if there is any work which is being done? So I think those will be my opening kind of questions. And if there's any other that needs to be taken, I'll be happy to pick out. But for now, anybody who wants to start in 1 minute as we wait for the others. Yes, Onesimus.
Thank you, Moses. I would want to respond to one question of the existence of the laws and the policies, and then failure to make progress. And I think it is related to one of the issues that I raised about coordination of institutions and government sectors. I see a lot of difficulty. Maybe I just need to indicate that I am a member of the Uganda Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, my stakeholder group. And I can see the task that Mr. Moses Kagwa is dealing with, because while there is some common understanding of where we want to go in terms of EITI, I don't think that there is a shared vision among other sectors, and he may have a lot of difficulty until there is that effective coordination of sectors and appreciation of where we want to move. And I think most of these laws have been sectorized. And it's like when it is a mining law, it is one sector that is supposed to be implementing that law. Yet there are several other actors and sectors that are supposed to implement the law. So unless we have that coordination mechanism in place and an accountability mechanism where every sector that has a responsibility of implementing a law is made to account, then we will continue to do these laws and policies, pile them up, and then we'll not be able to implement them. So we may need to hear again from the government side, because we need to help. Where is the problem? How can we do that coordination? I think that's my input in as far as that question is concerned. Thank you, Moses.
Thank you very much, Onesimus. Coordination is very important. I think that's the point that you're putting across. Nelly, in a minute.
Yes, I just wanted to add to what Onesimus was saying, also looking at the oversight function, perhaps that the Parliament is supposed to give in respect to implementation of laws, but also just oversight in making sure that some of those issues are dealt with, whatever inconsistencies there might be. And I think one of the challenges as civil society we face most times is that we spend quite a lot of time providing information, providing, I guess, even to a point where it's also capacity building and enhancing the ability to really scrutinize some of these issues. But you find, for the most times, if there is a change in parliamentarians from, one, sitting to another, there are a bit of inconsistencies there as well in how to get them to really have the will and the consistency and the zeal to really scrutinize some of these sectors. And so I can tell you for a fact, I'm not sure if the current parliament now is aware of some of these issues that are happening in the sectors, whether it's mining, oil and gas, and also the EITI, the initiative itself. I think a good number of them that were privy to information in that before are not in this current parliament. So I guess maybe now that the challenge we have, Moses, will be actually even the index itself, if there are plans to provide this information or use it to enhance the ability to debate some of these issues, so that oversight function is also, strengthened in a way. I think for me, that's also something that I would say is a huge challenge in addition to what Onesimus is saying. And so for me, that points to the very first thing I said, is how do we take this further so that it doesn't end here with us, civil society. I'm not sure if we have some parliamentarians on a call, but that getting them to get interested in these issues, because at some point the EITI, if there is a law in the sub-countries, they have that, will get to parliament. And so we have challenges there. I mean, we have over 500 parliamentarians at the moment. So how do we actually get people interested, those who are in a position of influence and a position of making and decisions, to really get interested in some of these issues and actually provide the oversight and all that, in as far as pushing for a more accountable sector. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Nelly, in terms of strengthening the accountability side, and of course the parliamentary oversight level, and the ability to be meaningfully be able to provide oversight, but also to input into the government processes. And of course, as you raised, it's a very significant point. The extractive sector is quite diverse, and the likelihood that sometimes, sometimes the political inclinations take over, the dynamics of it becomes very significant. So I think having a parliament which understands these dynamics is very important, and can help you in navigating through this tenacious terrain. Okay. Now let me go to Paul. You have a couple of questions, and I will give you a few minutes to just go over them before we now bring in Mr. Kagwa, because I know Mr. Kagwa is a government official, is very busy. Perhaps he would be wanting to do some of his remarks before jumping on to other calls. Paul, you had a question from Onesimus. Are we comparing oil and gas or not? And I think there was some response that you gave, but maybe you want to give some further clarity why we had those two. and maybe why it seems that perhaps the mining sector seems to be moving a little bit well. My experience is that sometimes government learn from mistakes, and it's very likely that since the mining sector is young, maybe the government has learned and is sort of putting in place some mechanism which it did not do when it was working with the oil sector. But again, that's an answer that you might want to respond to. There's also a question from Bashir PSG, and she said, I think I did miss the part on comparison with other countries in the scorecard. Would love to see how other countries are faring. So Paul, if you have an answer you can give. One thing for sure that I can tell you, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, is that Senegal is one of the countries that has received some of the highest scores in the NRGI 2021. And I was telling you when I was giving you the story that this sector is very murky, and government struggle, but what's very important is to improve along the way. And I think Senegal has come up a little bit over the years, but Paul, you might want to compare, or if you have some answers with some other countries. There's another question to you, Paul. You mentioned of climate change in your preliminary remarks, but she does not see how that influenced the scoring. So is that a primary factor or a parameter in the study? But I think you mentioned something about critical minerals, which is very significant for Uganda, by the way. The country is the Pearl of Africa, indeed it is. And I think opportunities are opening up in different fronts, and this could be one area. So Paul, maybe you might want to highlight a few there. There is a question from our colleague, Segoba Silwe, who is asking from Côte d'Ivoire. And he says, thanks for the presentation, but he wants to know if you noticed some specific issues according to the progressive involvement of Chinese companies in the extractive sector. Is there something to say about your country or your region? So perhaps maybe this is something that you also want to answer, whether the NRGI captured that, and perhaps maybe it could be from the critical minerals angle. But again, those are the questions for you. So if you can answer those for now, then we shall provide chance to Mr. Moses Kagwa to sort of give his final reflections and maybe also now try to drive us towards the conclusion of this session. Paul.
Thank you very much, Moses, and thanks for all those who asked the questions. I think I will start with Onesimus. We looked at the mining sector independent of the oil and gas. And as I pointed out earlier, and maybe these are some of the things that we continue to work on, we looked at the existence of laws and practices and whether this is being implemented. We also looked at other complementary features and institutions that exist. In his opening remarks, you remember the director pointed out very good things about the mining sector. For example, online registration and application, the existence of a cadastre, the existence of other factors, and a system of transferring of subnational resources to subnational governments. Now, those indicators, I think, helped to provide a basis. I do listen and I hear that the quality of the law and the effectiveness of the implementation, I think, are good things to kind of study and score. And in this case, what we tried to do was to look at the factors that help to ensure that there's some governance, as I've pointed out. We did not specifically compare oil and gas and mining. There are some similarities and the questions might have been similar. That wasn't the intention of the index. The intention of the index was to show that there are some things that are happening in the mining sector that I think point to some level of governance, but there's still issues that are outstanding. And in your presentation and in Nelly's presentation, I think this has been pointed out very much, that if we go onto the lower level, for example, you will find that there could be challenges there. We were unable, due to time and resources, to go onto that second level. But we looked at the issues that the director, for example, has pointed out. An online registration process, does it work? Doesn't it work? We didn't go to that level. There is a framework for sharing royalties. Is the rate sufficient? are local governments getting that money? We didn't go into that local level and into that level. And I do appreciate that here we're talking to people who are actually living some of these implementations, and you're finding these challenges. And I think that we should take the index as a beginning point to show generally where the issues that need to be continuously worked on. There could be additional issues that could be the work of a subsequent kind of research. In terms of comparison, in 2017, we did compare because we had a large sample. It was about 89 countries looking at 81 countries looking at 89 different aspects. And in that year, we did compare between one country and another. While the Resource Governance Index has uniform questions, in this year, we only had 18 countries. So we haven't been able to produce a comparison of the countries. What we want to do going forward, and this is part of the additional work to use this index to better inform the country, is to kind of bring some of those factors in those other countries, the best practices, and we compare with how Uganda is doing. That is work that we want to do subsequently, because then it will help provide better ammunition or better information for stakeholders to engage better with government. For example, to point out what makes governance in Senegal tick. And so we hope that we can be able to look at that, but also taking into consideration certain contextual factors. And we hope that once we do that analysis, we'll continue to share with you so that you can use this information to look at the good things in other countries and try to emulate them here. Now, climate change and energy transition were not actually graded. What we did was we recognized that these are new issues, these are emerging issues, and they're quite important. Obviously, a country like Uganda, which is just going to start energy production of oil and gas, issues around energy transition try to take a back seat. However, we wanted to point out that as you move along your path to discovery and production of oil, there are certain aspects that you need to look at. And I've shared the link to the reports. For those who read the report, we asked some questions about this energy transition. Most of our focus really was on this aspect of critical minerals, because we think that Uganda has an advantage in this case. You have oil, and oil is starting to flow, but as the oil flows, the demand for oil might start to go down because of the commitments of countries to meet climate change targets. Also, that at the same time, you have an advantage because the alternatives require certain products that are made out of minerals that are actually existing in the country. And so we wanted to start this whole conversation of you need to take care of climate change and what it means for fossil production. At the same time, you have an advantage that there are these minerals. We were requesting, and we suggest in the recommendations, that as a country, try to do everything to set the regulatory and institutional framework so that you can get a good deal in the exploitation of these minerals. A good deal might mean better better contracts, negotiation. It could mean value addition and beneficiation. It would also mean that you set up a framework, and many people have suggested, does it need to set up a national oil company? I mean, a national mining company. These are alternatives that you have. What we were trying to do in this index is to highlight this issue and say, you have an opportunity, don't let it pass by. Now, on the issue of China, as you noticed in the introduction, I said the index did not look at external factors. China, of course, is a very big factor. And our only way of looking at it was on this issue of, how can countries manage, especially with regard to resource-backed lending. And we see that China is a big player. It is a consumer of these products. Now, in terms of that, what does it mean? Does it want raw materials? Can you process? We didn't look at those external factors, but we looked at the government, and the good thing the government has done is it's publishing its debt, issues around its debt. There could be some debt around borrowed from China. There could be debt from other countries, but we see this as a very good thing in terms of transparency and accountability, that the government has come up and is open about the debt structure. Now, we didn't go into the detail of saying where is the debt coming from and which are the risky debts. I think that's a good conversation to have. We hope that as part of the future work to use the index to improve governance would be the next step, which stakeholders can take to say, yes, thank you. The index has credited government for publishing its debt, but what type of debt does it have? And how will it affect the revenues and the benefits from the oil and gas and the mining sector? I think those are very important questions. The index was not able to cover them, but that is work collectively with government, with the companies, and with civil society, we can continue to do and engage in. And I do appreciate these questions. I'll stop here for now and give an opportunity to the director.
Thank you so much, Paul, I think, for those wonderful remarks. And I think as we members, as we said, they're all, you can find all these country profiles across the world on our website. I think if you are interested, you can actually find them more. Because of time, we are not able to go into the details, but I think you'll see some good practices which can be adopted. Like, for example, contract disclosure. I think there's some very good examples from Ghana's oil and gas sector. I think we have our colleagues from Ghana on the line, on the call. There are some very good disclosures as well on practice when you look at Guinea, for example, in their mining sector. And in general, Mexico, for example, also has some very good practices which you can be able to sort of really look and see if they help. Tunisia is another one as well. They're also performing well. When it comes to public officials, I think where Uganda seems to have scored badly in terms of their disclosure, you can look at Ghana, Colombia, and Mongolia. They have very good rules in place that allows public officials who have holdings in extractive companies to disclose their interests. And of course, the same when it comes to Tanzania. I think they have just strengthened their beneficial ownership role, and Ghana. Again, when it comes to financial assets, there's very good examples that we're seeing in Colombia and Peru. They can also provide some kind of an inspiration for Uganda as a country. And I can tell you that, again, across the world, we have realized that your mining cadastre is also one example which is coming out as a very good practice for other countries also to reflect on. Of course, similarly with Tanzania. So I think there's some examples as well that you can look at during your own private time and make and see if there's anything that you think can be able to be used for improving governance in the country. And I think that's the beauty about the NRGI. It gives you a sense of how you can be able to move across this tenacious journey of the extractive sector. As I said, countries struggle, especially if they're starting like Uganda. You have to be open and look across and be able to improve. With those remarks, now let me invite Mr. Kagwa to just share his perspectives. I think you've heard from all the presentation and the different views. Please feel free to take on without any angle. Just do it at your own pleasure. And I think I'll give you something like a maximum around 10 minutes. If you can be able to do that, then we shall invite our colleague Silas to wrap up for us this session. Thank you.
Thank you, Moses. 10 minutes may be too many for me, but I just want to thank all the participants. No, I was joking. To thank all the participants for the very wonderful comments and the questions they have asked. I think they're very, very important as we embark on this journey for good governance in the extractive sector. I also want to thank the panelists, Onesimus and Nelly, for your wonderful comments and your suggestions on what we can do to improve governance. But I also want to thank very much Paul for his presentation, showing areas where, as government, we need to improve. And of course, we've been having discussions on how we would want to improve. And one of the things we thought about was, for example, we have a law that says that all revenues emanating from petroleum activities go to the petroleum fund. And then the petroleum fund, to remove those revenues from the petroleum fund, there are only two areas they go to the budget, but are through an appropriation, and that is for infrastructure development. And of course, infrastructure has never been defined properly. So there's been money that would go out, and questions have been, is this the things that we thought would be there? Is the investment advisory committee yet in place with these regulations to ensure that this that the rules are properly followed? So there is that. And then when the money, the rest of the money goes to the petroleum investments reserve, and that one, you can't get it out for anything. So there is that area where it's lacking, and I think we are going to work on that. But as government, we have formed the investment as advisory committee to start making the investment policy on how we are going to invest the resources that we have put there. So it's a lot of work, but I think we are moving in the right direction in that regard. We are going to look at the areas where we said we are not performing well and move. And one of the things that I must admit here is that I'm part of the EITI MSG. I'm actually the chairman. So we have been looking at these issues. Where can we comply with the EI standard? So all these issues of disclosure, all issues of transparency, all issues of governance, we are dealing with them. Onesimus is one of my colleagues on that group. So I think he has already mentioned how serious we are. And I think there are some of my colleagues who are listening in. So it shows the commitment of government to ensure that there is transparency and good governance. And I wouldn't want someone to say, oh, Solicitor General said this. We are engaging Solicitor General. We actually wrote to him on how we can disclose. So there will be disclosure in accordance with the law. There should be no concerns that are raised that we are going to become opaque in that regard. Simon Taylor has raised a number of interesting issues, but I will start with the last ones about threats and intimidation of citizens on the pathway of the ECOP. Government, in as far as acquiring a right of way for all its projects, has been clear. It has followed the law. You cannot take someone's property without paying prompt and adequate compensation. In fact, one of the challenges we've had with a lot of projects in Uganda, why they have delayed, is the issue of right of way. A lot of people would come and say, well, you are going to compensate me this amount of money, I can't move because what you are giving me is low. Even when the chief government valuer has given a value, people dispute it, and projects stall until this is resolved. So I'm really surprised that for ECOP, there could be threats and intimidations. This is, I'm hearing about this for the first time, because we have provided money in the budget. Some people have been compensated, others have not been compensated because the money had not come through the process. But that doesn't mean to say that they were being intimidated. So I don't know how this is, but it's something that maybe Simon can tell us more, and we take it up with the relevant authorities, because it's the Ministry of Energy, to see whether this is really happening. But from what I know, the practice of government is that nobody can be expropriated of his property without adequate compensation. And I'll leave it at that. But Simon, please give us more details, then we can see what is really happening. There was also an issue of revenue streams that could come as a result of building the ECOP pipeline. Are they realistic? The pipeline is being constructed by private developers, though we have been also called to have an interest in it as government and the government of the United Republic of Tanzania. But of course, the way it is done, it's based on, there's a tariff which is supposed to be paid per barrel of the oil that goes through, which is $12.77 US. And then there are guarantees on the amount of oil that should flow through that pipeline. So we have tried as much as possible, based on the information we have, to make realistic projections for the amount of oil that would go in there and how we are going to pay. And also projections for our share, if we take a share in that, which we will take in the pipeline. So these are realistic because they are based on the information we have. They are based on what we have calculated based on models which have been tested and proven. So based on those models, we have factored in the revenue streams that will be coming out of that. So I would want to assure everybody that, yes, most of these things that we are doing in the oil and gas sector have been carefully thought about, and the financial implications have been put on the table before we proceeded to do anything. So that's what I wanted to say, but also to tell colleagues that we have submitted the second charter for fiscal responsibility to Parliament, and in that charter there is a fiscal rule on how much oil is going to go through. I mean, how much oil revenues are going to be removed from petroleum fund for use in financing the budget. So that has been done going forward. I hope that will help in raising our score as far as the NRGI is concerned. Moses, thank you so much, and colleagues, thank you so much for listening to me.
Yeah, thank you so much indeed, Moses. I think for such an elaborate response, some of these issues, the discussion around these issues, I mean, you can actually have a long discussion, but of course time does not allow. And I think sometimes we just say that, you know, the start of the launch of the NRGI is the start for a journey for further discussion. So I think that gives us an opportunity to continuously discuss some of these issues that may have not been well covered. But I think you have tried to capture a number of elements which are very fundamental and quite significant. And some of the questions within the chart, these are things that we can constantly reflect on and see how to be handled. So in the interest of time, let me invite now Silas, who is our co-director for Africa at NRGI, who has been working so tirelessly behind the scenes with our global teams to ensure that actually all the studies across the Anglophone Africa are well coordinated and presented. Some of you have met Silas before, but I think he'll be very delighted to tell a little bit more about himself and also be able to sort of really put this in context and wrap up our discussion for today. I want to thank everyone who has joined us across the world and the team at NRGI across the world, Berlin, London, New York, who have worked so significantly to bring this to place. And of course, Paul down there in Uganda and all of us in East Africa who have supported this process. And again, the Ministry of Finance who have worked with us in delivering this today. But let me welcome Silas to give us some closing remarks as we bring this to an end. Silas.
Thank you very much, Moses, and distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen. Let me start by expressing my thanks to you all for joining us in the launch of Uganda NRGI for 2021. Your active and dynamic participation has not only made this launch a successful event, but also a clear demonstration of your commitment and interest in ensuring that the good people of Uganda do not only receive lasting benefits from the country's extractive resources, but also experience reduced harm associated with extraction of these resources. And in principle, this is what underlies the NRGI mission. And I'm coordinating and actually overseeing our work around the Anglophone Africa, currently covering Ghana, Uganda, Tanzania, and Nigeria. Now, let me give a special thanks to our special guest speaker, Mr. Moses Kagwa, for making time out of your busy schedule to join us and for delivering quite a rich and insightful keynote address, highlighting key and commendable progress made by the government of Uganda and the challenges ahead in the governance of the country's natural resources, particularly oil, gas, and minerals. Much appreciated, and please convey our gratitude to the entire government for sustained cooperation over the years, and we really look forward for continued cooperation in this particular area. To our distinguished panelists, Nelly and Onesimus, we really appreciate you all for sharing your great reflections on the findings of the NRGI, and we thank you so much. I think the points you've raised are quite interesting, and we will really give it a serious thought on how we can actually address where you have observed some of the gaps. Thanks to all our funders as well, in NORAD in particular, for your generous support and trust in NRGI, which actually made the production of 2021 NRGI possible. Last but not the least, thanks to entire NRGI team for all the preparations for this launch. I know how much effort has gone into this in the background. And special thanks to Paul for great coordination on the ground and across the organization, and also for a great presentation, and Moses for fantastic moderation of the event. Thank you, Paul and Moses. I think there are a few issues that emerged from the discussion, which I think will inform a future discussion, but I just wanted to clarify a little bit of that. There was a question of comparison between oil, gas, and mineral sectors. In principle, and we are not comparing the two sectors in a particular country. That is not what NRGI actually focused on. But naturally, you cannot avoid looking at the composite scores of NRGI in the two sectors and trying to see why sector A or mining sector is having this score and not in sector B. I think that is naturally come across, naturally, and that is what we are trying to highlight. But methodologically, we are not trying to compare oil and gas as part. These are two separate sectors, and some of the questions are very specific to a particular sector. Inter-country comparison, yes, I think Paul has addressed that quite clearly. We are in the 2017 and previous years, we tried to cover a bigger sample of countries, but due to resource limitations this year, we decided really we wouldn't be able to cover many countries, so we focused on a limited set of countries, particularly the countries where NRGI has programs. Now, there was also a question about the scope of RGI in terms of effectiveness of the policy or measuring the policy outcomes. While this is a very important, and we have been actually debating internally on whether it is possible to address that, but I think finally we realized that methodologically this can be quite complex in developing the same assessment criteria across countries. Because when you talk about value realization, what would be kind of a common criteria to assess country A and country B has actually realized value from their resources. It is possible to be done at a country level, but that will not really be. It will be very complex to incorporate that into the RGI. And I think an attempt to do that may not yield very meaningful results, from a comparative point of view. Last few parting words, really, I think Moses underscored that, the launch marks the beginning of a series of focused dialogue on the findings. And I would like to plead with you all, to take RGI scores as a catalyst, to improve on the areas where we found, need some improvement. And we believe, if we work on this collectively and together, the next RGI, I believe, will be much, much better than the current one. And this should be our own responsibility. I just want to reaffirm NRGI commitment to support all stakeholders in this journey to improve governance of Uganda's oil, gas, and mineral resources. The links to the country profiles and workbooks are available for your own reference, and please make use of these resources and do not hesitate to reach out to us with any question related to those documents, and that will form ongoing discussion within us. The team here has taken note of key issues that emerged from the keynote address, panel discussion, and chats, and will ensure NRGI, take necessary action where that is needed. And with those few remarks, and mindful of time, I wish you all the best in your efforts to have a great day, and thank you very much.